Francis of the Filth, Chapter 10. In the late summer of that year, Frank woke by a house in a village that looked across the river and the plain to the mountains. The manner of his waking confused him because he rose from the mire of the rice fields exactly the same way he had submerged into them. So his initial assumption was that the transport had failed and that he was still a fugitive in the rice fields realm. But on sitting up and looking out over the sheaths, he was pleasantly surprised to see a very pretty, picturesque landscape of gentle hills, scattered rice fields dotted with ancient farmhouses, the odd cow and goat lazing in the sun, and a languorous river tinkling before all. The atmosphere of this place, though new to him, had an air of familiarity. He trudged his way through the thick mud to one of the narrow paved roads lining the paddy. It linked up with others, forming a patchwork of neat scars over the countryside, dividing the fields and linking them at the same time. With a swampy scent wafting behind his muddied shirt, he strolled down the road, by an old timber residence, toward the river, feeling rather carefree and blithe. The river was lined with the trees which trickled the branches into the cool water and cast afternoon shadows over the shiftless fish. A road, possibly considered a major artery in this part of the world, ran parallel to the river, and its junction with the road Frank was traveling down. There was a signpost pointing to the left, on which was written, Fukui. This was exceedingly good news for Frank. Not only was he back in Japan, but Fukui was, so he believed, a very agreeable, if not slightly dull, part of the world to be visiting. The only thing that concerned him was whether this was indeed the true Fukui, or an alternate version of it, as the recently visited New York and Godor had been. This matter was soon established when he stumbled upon 2 black eggs on the bank of the stream. They were large, almost the size of turnips, and with his appetite returning, he felt that, scrambled, they would make a very fine meal. He picked them up and fingered them, smelt them, and even gave them a little lick. They were still warm. Just as he was about to gather some kindling for a fire, he was doused with an enormous blob of white fluid. This was not merely a soupy liquid, but contained substantial matter as well. What didn't run his face or get caught in his hair went down the back of his shirt, and it truly reeked. He looked up just as a huge winged creature descended in front of him.
"What the hell are you doing with those eggs, man?"
"Oh, great,"
said Frank. All illusions of normality is now shattered.
"A talking bird."
You better believe it. It's Percy the pigeon, bitch. Now, I ask you a question. You gotta put those eggs back, or am I gonna whip your ass?
"Can I have just one?"
One whipping?
"All right, I'll leave them. Sheesh. Jeez, I was just hungry. Just wanted a little something to nibble."
Right. So how about next time I's hungry? I's just gonna nibble one of your nuts.
"Point taken."
Dumbass.
"But you didn't have to go and take a dump all over me."
I didn't. You were about to eat my progeny, you sick schmuck. And even if you weren't, you sure as hell done someone else that deserves a dumping.
I didn't know they were eggs.
Like that matters, you low down, good for notion asswipe. So you're okay eating my brother's kids? I really ought to peck your eyes out, then dump on you all over again.
All right, enough already. I'm sorry.
Fool.
So what is there to eat around here then?
Are you blind as well as stupid? There's a river right in front of you, teeming with fish.
Yeah, I just didn't want to eat someone else's family, you know? I don't want a big mother fish to step out from behind a tree and attack me or anything.
Percy the pigeon looked at him with a pained expression.
A mother fish? Step out from behind a tree? Man, you're really messed up. You're sick in the fucking head.
Frank climbed down the small bank, waded into the river, and then plonked himself under the cool flow. He enjoyed the feeling of being submersed in pristine waters. It tickled him all over. He couldn't remember the last time he had fully bathed, and he rose to the surface, utterly refreshed. Sadly, his desecration of the river had the opposite effect on the wildlife, and he lifted his head to see whole schools of fish floating sick and bloated on the surface of the water. It made for easy pickings. He gathered a few choice-looking ones, and left the rest to recover in peace further down the river, which is where they quickly escaped to. When the fish were cooked and ready for consumption, Percy the pigeon dropped back down and sat across from him by the fire. Frank looked at him curiously.
You gonna share them fish with me, ain't you?
After you dumped on me?
Percy puffed his chest up to an enormous size and gave a guttural coo. Frank took the hint.
Go on, you have that one.
He said, pushing one toward him.
Thanks, man.
He said in a totally different tone.
You're not so bad after all.
So we're somewhere near Fukui.
Uh-huh.
And I'm guessing you're native to this area.
Am now. My granddaddy come here from America when he were a boy and grew up in these hills. And then my daddy grew up in these hills till I was hatched. And then he disappeared right about the time they started serving yakitori in town. Damn. No shame, these people. Eating whatever moves in front of them.
And what do you do in these parts? Seems kind of quiet.
I keep busy.
He scratched his chin with a claw.
Dumping mainly.
Frank nodded his understanding.
I wait for someone be moving, and then I fly to a branch or a wire right above them. I do gastric cooking, if you know what I mean, and then I let go and wham. I won't be surprised if I don't hit them 9 times out of 10.
I can believe that.
Frank said, picking some foreign matter from his hair.
But what about the people? Are they mostly farmers out here?
A lot of them are farmers. Some are shop people. Others work for the Agricultural Council, but no one seems to know exactly what they do.
He ripped a big piece of fish with his beak, threw his head back, and gobbled it down.
Damn, that's good.
Frank sat listening for more.
Then there's the market on Saturdays. That's when damn near Eve one comes out and sells them wares. It's really the only time the place has any life at all.
Topping heaven, I guess.
No, man, respect. You don't dump at the market. You just don't do that. That ain't cool. The market's a sacred place.
Percy, I think I might hang out here for a while. I like this place. Frank and Fukui. Fukui Frank. It has a nice ring to it, don't you think?
Hey, whatever roasts your rice.
I think I'll chill here before heading off to see if I can locate my buddies. I need to find somewhere to stay. Maybe get a job for a while. Blend in with the people. Become a community man. Got any ideas?
You? Blend? Shit, man. All I know is to dump on people. That's what I do. You know, you gotta find what you do best, and then you do that. I dump on people. That's what I do. And damn, I'm good at it. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I'm quite partial to taking dump myself. I'm just less inclined to do it on people, and I can't see it endearing me to the local folk if I do. You know what I'm saying?
Well, why don't you go and ask the old farmer dude back up on the hill there? Maybe he can give you an idea.
Frank turned around to see the old house he had passed as he walked down the hill. On the rickety ancient veranda was an equally rickety ancient man, sitting rigid and lifeless, looking out over the fields and the river. Frank bid adieu to Percy and made his way back up the hill toward the old farmhouse, careful not to walk under any wires. As the homestead loomed into view, the farmer's wife came out and joined him, and together they sat, as still as statues on the deck. When Frank was within calling range, he waved a hand and said a friendly, "Hey!" They never moved. He repeated the gesture and called in a slightly louder voice. They remained wholly detached. It was as though they were blind and deaf. On moving closer, he saw the problem. They were both deceased. They sat, all mummified sinew and flesh, staring out through empty eyes with mouths frozen agape and partially exposed bones. In any other realm, this would have terrified Frank to the core, but here, there was an air of timeless benevolence, even among the departed. Perhaps it was the intent. The soulless bodies of the rice field realm were harbingers of horror, and they targeted Frank. Here, there wasn't even a hint of hostility. Just people, dead or alive, going about their business. He took the liberty of walking around the side of the house and onto the veranda. The decking creaked and bent under him as he moved. He stood just in front and to the side of them, and then made his introduction.
Good afternoon, my name is Frank.
This was met with complete silence.
Frank.
He repeated. The two figures continued to stare, as cold as stones, out over the fields.
I was wondering if you would be so kind as to let me know where I might be able to find a place to stay for the night.
This was met again by a total indifference.
Wintel.
A gentle breeze fluttered across the patio.
A campsite, even in dry hole would work. I'm not particular.
Suddenly, the wife rose from her chair and beckoned him to follow. She creaked as she walked. She led him into the house toward a back room, and once there, pointed to a perfectly made futon in the middle of the floor.
Is this for me?
Yes,
she said in a rusty voice. It clearly pained her to speak.
I don't mean to be any trouble.
Frank said. It had been a lifetime since he had needed to speak civilly to anyone. The old corpse pointed once again to the futon and then headed back to the deck. There, she returned to her seat. Frank leaned against the side railing, and the three of them sat in silence and watched the sun set over the mountain beyond the river. When the darkness had descended, the old man stood and walked out into the hills. Frank watched from the deck as he moved, at times almost floating backwards and forwards through the fields. The old woman went into the kitchen and prepared a feast for her guest, and when it was done, Frank sat alone at a table covered with steaming dishes and boiling pots. She then retired for the evening, leaving Frank to feast and her husband to walk to the fields. Frank gorged like a pig, and when he was done, he got into the clean, warm futon and enjoyed a rare night of fat, untroubled sleep. For the next several days, Frank stayed with the old couple and helped with the harvesting of sweet potatoes in return for their hospitality. For the man mummy, Frank was godsend. With his rickety frame, bending over to dig up the crops was a nightmare. So with Frank doing the hard work and him just wheeling the barrow beside him, life was as good as it could get for a deceased person. The satisfaction was mutual. It surprised Frank how much he enjoyed toiling in the sun, soiling his hands, and reaping the fruits of his labor in such a literal way. And the old lady mummy kept cooking up feasts that were to die for. Although this realm was clearly an alternate one, Frank felt a deep affiliation and comfort with it. He felt at home here, as much or even more than he had in Okinawa. On the first Saturday after his arrival, he accompanied the old man and his wife to the market. He wheeled an enormous cart with all the sweet potatoes they had harvested throughout the week, with the old couple stoically shuffling beside it. At the market, the town came alive, so to speak. The old couple remained as they were, as did numerous other perished folk who had similarly brought their wares. But the market also teemed with the living, mere mortals, rank-and-files from all over the omniverses, brute beasts and all kinds. They all set up shop and moved about with a sense of purpose and pleasure. After spending the better part of the day selling sweet potatoes with the old man, the old woman had gone off to do the buying. Frank took leave to stroll through the market and see what was on offer. It was a curious and highly eclectic mix of merchandise, everything from radishes to coffee to bohemian leatherware to t-shirts advertising the glories of foreign dimensions and realms, including, rather ironically to Frank, one welcoming people to the rice fields.
Sup, my man?
Came a voice from behind him.
Percy the pigeon!
Frank was delighted to see an old friend.
What have you been up to? On second thoughts, you probably don't mean to tell me, but what are you doing here at the market?
Selling goods, man. Taking it day by day.
He said, standing in front of his stall.
What are you selling, Percy?
All sold out, my man. Busy morning. We sold out like there's no tomorrow.
He continued to move backwards and forwards in front of his stall, as though to block Frank.
Come on now, Percy.
He chuckled with a wagging finger.
What are you hiding from me?
Nothing, man. I was just about to pack up shop. We all sold out.
Then we have here.
Called Frank, stepping by the bird.
Eggs. Percy the pigeon, are you selling eggs?
I can explain this, man.
Whoa, I like to hear it. What about eating someone's progeny, you sick schmuck?
Frank recited back to him.
What about eating my brother's kids?
Now you gotta understand.
He said with a bad stutter.
These are hen eggs, not pigeon eggs.
What's the difference?
What's the difference? What's the difference? I ought to take you out the back, whip you with a rubber hose on you twice for saying that. What's the difference? What's the difference between a Frank and a single-cell amoeba? Probably not much. But between a pigeon and a hen, there's everything, man. There's intelligence, there's smarts, there's soul.
He poked Frank in the shoulder with each point.
Hens and pigeons are tears apart. Not even close. We're dimensions, man. And something else. Hens are damn ugly. Don't forget it.
All right, Percy, don't get your feathers in a flap.
Frank turned and moved on.
You say schmuck.
He muttered.
I heard that.
Percy called.
Not you.
Frank lied.
The doctor's selling over here. It looks sick.
Frank continued to nosy from one dusty stall to another, fascinated by all there was on offer, and frankly quite disturbed that anyone would want to buy much of it. He stumbled upon an antique stall manned by an odd-looking character dressed in a flying cap and goggles with a yellow scarf, a bright pink shirt tucked into a pair of safari shorts and workman's boots. The stall sold old kettles and picture frames, model airplanes and spinning tops, water pumps and chairs made of bones. Yet what really called Frank's attention was lying on the bottom of a box of what appeared to be discarded items. The box was labeled "worthless" and was filled with mainly broken pieces of crockery and odd sandals. Yet right at the bottom, Frank saw and retrieved a recorder. At first, he couldn't be sure it wasn't any old recorder, but as he observed it, he could see the color distortions and the grain texture. It had the exact abrasions from lifting the manhole cover in New York, and most of all, it had the slimy aroma of his dear friend. This was, with any doubt, Salamander Man's recorder. Frank was over the moon.
Where did you get this?
Frank asked the man. He was intimidated by Frank's intensity and took a step back.
Where did you get this?
Frank repeated, elevating his tone.
I don't know. I don't remember. It wasn't me.
Listen, buddy, I'm not after you, but this belongs to a good friend of mine and I need to find him. Now, where did you get this?
It was brought to me. I don't get any of this stuff myself. Bounty hunters and realm scavengers bring it to me. They find it. They bring it. We trade. That's how it works. We trade.
Who's the scavenger that brought this?
Frank pressed.
I don't know.
He whined.
Get brought it!
Frank yelled, holding it up to his face in a threatening manner.
I don't know, Frank. I swear I don't.
The man sputtered. His voice was trembling.
How do you know my name?
What? I don't know your name. Never heard of you. Who are you again?
Frank grabbed him by the collar and buried his nose into the man's cheek.
Start talking, dipshit, or I swear I'll end you.
The man broke down.
All right, I'll tell you, just leave me alone.
He wailed in a falsetto panic. He caught his breath for a moment.
Everyone knows your name, Frank. Everyone. There isn't a person here who doesn't know who you are or talk about what's happening. We don't know what's fact and what's fiction. But we do know the tiers are shifting, and we know that you are a part of it. As for the flute,
He pointed to the recorder.
It was given to me by a scavenger called Dr. Sack, and he lives in this very realm. Can't say if he's here now, because he's always traveling. But his home is just a day's walk north from here.
He looked Frank calmly in the eye.
Beyond the rice fields, by a lake at the foot of the Twin Peaks. Now please release me.
Frank wasted no time. He noticed an old bicycle standing at the back of the man's stall, and he quickly laid his hands on it.
Hey, that's mine.
The man said.
It's not for sale!
I'm not buying it,
said Frank, absconding with it. Then, without so much as a goodbye to the old farmer and his wife, he set off from the market with a fresh resolve and began pedaling his way north. The sun was bright, the roads were straight, and he was cycling through the rice fields, appeared to be completely devoid of soulless bodies, feisty negus, or seductive chimpillas. Frank began to hum a little tune as he pedaled. By the mid-afternoon, the Twin Peaks loomed into view, and the landscape gently transformed from rice fields into taiga forest, and from gently sloping topography into rolling hills. The uphill climbs were no fun, but the downhill free falls made them worthwhile. Frank would coast down them, legs wide apart, wind in his groin and a yeehaw in his voice. It was on one of these runs that, rounding a curve, he almost ran into the largest water buffalo he'd ever seen. Huge. Unnaturally so. This thing was of prehistoric proportions, and it stood right over the middle of the road, completely blocking it. As intimidating as it looked, however, it spoke in the most gentlemanly tones.
I'm terribly sorry, old chap, but I cannot let you pass.
I don't think you understand.
Frank started.
I need to find the man who bought this recorder.
He held it up for the Colossus to see.
It's a magnificent instrument, sir, but I cannot let you pass.
Why not?
Frank asked.
There's a scavengers convention going on, and I've been employed to make sure that it remains undisturbed.
Frank walked around and put his hand up on the brute's shoulder.
That's impressive.
He said, giving it a bit of a squeeze.
Jim been working out, huh?
The creature looked flattered.
Well, yeah.
It was weird to see such a powerful creature speak in such bashful tones.
Getting the steroids?
Frank pressed.
Well,
It just looked embarrassed now.
What's your name? What are you, my friend?
My name is Tyrone, sir. I'm a rank and file, but I'm trying to work my way up to Chimpilla status.
He leaned in as if to whisper a deep mystery.
They say the tiers are changing.
He looked around before speaking on.
One doesn't want to get left behind in these things.
Quite right.
Frank said, keeping his hand on the creature's shoulder. He was unaware that he was shrinking. Frank continued to reassure him.
A creature like you, so big, so strapping, you can really go places, you know. Jump tiers. I can see you being a creature of great influence.
Really?
He asked with a smirk he couldn't hide.
Absolutely.
By this point, he was reduced to the size of a young cow, and on finding himself now looking up at Frank, he asked in a state what was going on.
I'm just borrowing, my friend. I'm just borrowing. It's gonna be okay.
By the time he fully realized his situation, he was too small and too weak to resist. In the end, Frank took a ton of chromosomes from him, but left just enough for him to continue living as miniature cattle.
What have you done to me?
He asked in a scared, squeaky voice.
Less methane now, my friend. You'll be a real hit with the ladies, and I have some important work to do at the convention.
Frank hopped back on his bicycle and left the little calf to wander helplessly backwards and forwards across the road he had only very recently presided over. A modest-sized lake lay before the twin mountains, just as the man in the stall had said, and a small log cabin sat in front of the lake. Frank stopped pedaling and let his bike roll the rest of the way downhill and right up to the edge of the property. The cabin was a humble one, rustic and splintered with a slight slant, which gave it a charming old-world appearance. Gray plumes of smoke puffed out from the chimney, and a solitary hen cuckolded and scratched at the ground near the front steps. A gust of wind blew across the lake, bringing a scent of camphor from the trees. Frank stepped onto the bottom step.
Hello?
He called. There was no answer. The hen continued to scratch and peck. He slowly clunked his way up to the top.
Hello?
He called again.
Anyone here?
Looking up, he could see the billows of smoke blowing up into the late afternoon sky. There was still not a word in reply. He made his way onto the deck, leaned on the gnarled wooden railing, and looked out over the pleasant country scene. It was then he heard a click and felt the cool end of a metal cylinder pressed up against his temple.
Get off my deck and get the hell off my property before I blow a hole in your head the size of a grapefruit,
bellowed a voice. Without a word, Frank gingerly stepped back down the stairs and out into the front yard. He turned to look at the man. He was a short, pudgy man, aging, with long, stringy brown hair and a tawny brown hat on his head. His clothes were of a color that almost matched his hat, but not quite, and were of a style that one would associate with hunting season. He never took his eyes off Frank.
I just wanted to ask a simple question.
Frank said in a kindergarten voice. The man cocked his gun and bellowed again.
I ain't warning you second time.
At that moment, another gust of wind blew across the lake and over their faces. The man's expression relaxed. He lowered the gun and then broke into a soft chuckle. He looked at Frank.
Well, good afternoon there, friend. What can I be doing for you this afternoon?
Though he was pleased to be spoken to in a less bloodthirsty way, Frank looked at this guy with serious reservations. He was still nervous in this man's presence.
I was wondering if I could ask you about some of the items you have collected on your travels across the omniverses.
Well, of course,
he said with a tremendous cheer.
In fact, we're holding a scavengers convention right here as we speak.
You are?
Frank asked.
Where is everyone?
Here!
He said, pointing around at empty spaces and chairs.
Come on up, my friend. Come and take a seat and join us, and I'll grab you a glass, and you can have yourself some whiskey, and we'll all talk until late in the evening about some of the treasures we found, and some that just escaped us, too.
He let out a loud guffaw at the recollection of some of these. Frank took the steps 2 by 2 and stood back up on the quaint timber deck, waiting to be shown inside. Right then, another gust of wind blew across the lake. It ruffled the old hen's feathers and sent the chimney smoke off into the trees.
I thought I told you to get off my property,
came the same roar as before. Frank turned to see the old man with his rifle pointed right at his face, a centimeter from his nose. When Frank, stunned by the psyche of this man, failed to move, he pressed it firmly onto Frank's nose and pushed him all the way to the bottom of the steps.
Now go on, get...
He was as livid as a freshly castrated bull.
I ain't warning you a second time.
Making no sudden moves, Frank walked from the property and got on his bicycle. The man's steely gaze never left Frank. As he was about to pedal off, another puff of breeze blew across the lake. The old man's hair and beard waved in the wind. He looked across at Frank and called out to him.
Friend, leaving so soon? We have much more to show you, more tales to tell, and more whiskey to drink.
He let out another series of crackerjack laughs and gestured for Frank to come back. Sensing there was something in the wind which disagreed with this man, not to mention the fact that he was a complete psychopath, Frank hurried back up onto the deck and bustled him inside the cabin, where it was unlikely the wind could wreak any more havoc on his troubled soul. And there, once inside, with the door closed and the windows shuttered, they did indeed enjoy an afternoon of treasure and tales and whiskey, with a large number of other scavengers who may or may not have actually been there.
My name's Frederick von Scrotumhauser. My friends call me Dr. Sack.
When the timing was right, Frank produced Salamander Man's recorder and showed it to Dr. Sack, who held it lightly in his hands and gave a familiar, nostalgic nod.
I do remember this, I do. Not worth much, you know. There are thousands of these all over the Omniverse, and this one's in poor condition. I could take it back off your hands for a few hundred chromosomes.
Who sold it to you?
Frank asked, ignoring his proposition.
This is very important to me.
A reptilian fellow, if I remember it correctly. Rather odd looking. White body, green head, bulgy eyes. And he had this rather odd and disturbing habit of rubbing his nipples every once in a while. Rather odd, I must say.
That's him,
said Frank with great delight.
Was he alone?
Not at all. A rather ragtag band, I remember now. Yes, it's coming back to me. He was with a pink guy and some pathetic little drooling runt, and they kept a drone buzzing above them for some reason too. Rather odd, really.
That's them,
Frank said.
That's them.
That's who?
Dr. Sack asked.
Some friends of mine. I have to go there immediately. I need the coordinates. Give me the coordinates. They're in dimension 69Y34P29 of realm 6.2, right?
Dr. Sack looked stunned.
Yes, that's right. How did you know?
Frank looked stunned.
Didn't you just tell me?
No.
I don't know how I knew. I just knew.
They looked at each other like deer in headlights for a while before Frank headed for the door.
Thank you for your hospitality. Please don't bother seeing me out.
Not at all, not at all. Of course I will see you out.
No, really, I insist. I got it from here. Thank you again, and I'll see you all when I see you. Oh, and thanks for the whiskey. That was some quality stuff.
Frank closed the door behind him and hurriedly made his way downstairs. Dr. Sack came out onto the deck and waved goodbye to his friend. The sun was just about to dip beneath the horizon.
Do come back again,
he said with a hint of melancholy in his voice. Right then, the wind blew over once again from the lake. The left side of Dr. Sack's face twitched. He looked down at the decking under his feet and then back up. In an instant, he had his gun back in his hand and was yelling at Frank, all savagery and frothing madness.
Hey, I thought I told you to get off my land.
He was really livid now. There was a rage in his voice that frightened even the trees. He cocked his gun and took aim at Frank. Frank ran for his bicycle and stepped on the hen in the process. He was an easy target for the gunman. Just as Dr. Sack was squeezing the trigger, he was suddenly doused in a thick, soupy lather.
What the hell?
As he scooped the secretion from his eyes, he was shocked to see a large gray bird standing in front of him.
Is Percy the pigeon, you turd-faced imbecile? No one takes a shot at my friends.
Percy the pigeon!
Percy and Dr. Sack stood there sizing each other up.
Frank, you get going now.
Percy said without taking his eyes off Dr. Sack. Frank hopped on his bicycle and raced up the hill away from the house, in the direction he had come from.
And don't even think about pointing that thing at me.
He said to Dr. Sack.
Or me and my family will make this area our home, and we will dump on you morning and night, till this house ain't nothing but a mountain of pigeon poop.
Dr. Sack thought about the prospects of that and turned in a huff, marched inside and slammed the door. Percy turned to the hen.
Damn ugly.
Frank lost no time leaving Dr. Sack's property once and for all and quickly rode up and over the hill that led back into the sparse woodlands. The trees were nothing but dark silhouettes on the landscape now. There, still wandering the road like a lost lamb, was Tyrone, the formerly magnificent bull. He bleated Frank in a trembling, pathetic voice.
What have you done to me? What have you done?
Frank was not one to feel sorry for anyone, but in this case he was willing to make an exception. He rested his hand on the young calf's shoulder and assured him everything would be all right. It was very calming for the young squeak, and as Frank kindly spoke to him about the dangers of taking security work for complete and utter psychopaths, he began to return to him the chromosomes he had borrowed. Within a few short minutes, Tyrone was standing way above Frank and was already half the size of his formerly magnificent self. Frank removed his hand at that point and wished him all the best. Tyrone looked at himself.
I'm sure I was bigger than this.
He said in a deeper voice, not sure at all about it.
I think you still have some of my chromosomes.
think so. That was about it. Besides, you really were a little on the bulky side before.
Do you think so?
Absolutely, and we both know where that leads.
Heart disease?
Erectile dysfunction. And believe me, brother, you don't want that.
Well, I sure appreciate that. Thank you.
Not at all. You keep well now.
With that, Frank cycled off, still with a feeling of great anticipation, to find a quiet place to make his transport. He chose a secluded grassland and scoured the area for an object to start his work. This wasn't easy in the dark, but he found the broken femur bone of a young mammal, with a very sharp point at one end, and this became his weapon of choice. He held it to the base of his hand to commence proceedings. Suddenly, a large figure overhead blocked the light of the moon and dropped down in front of him, giving the shock of his life.
You ain't leaving, are ya?
The voice conveyed genuine disappointment.
Percy, I've got to go and get my friends.
But I's your friend, ain't I?
Yeah, Percy, you are my friend, but I have to.
Then take me too. Take me with you, Frank.
I can't do that, Percy. I don't know what lies ahead. There are some pretty awful realms out there, believe me. Why would you want to leave a place like this? Besides, I need to keep all the chromosomes I can get.
Percy looked deeply disappointed at this.
Can I at least watch you leave?
Sure, buddy, whatever preens your pinions.
Frank lay on a thick rug of grass and looked up at the diamond sky stretched out above him. He was very comfortable.
Hey, Percy, say goodbye to the old farmer and his wife for me.
Sure thing.
With one smooth movement, Frank sliced his palm and, still in a lying position, swung his arm around him to create a circle of life. He called the coordinates calmly into the night sky and felt the dew moisten the back of his shirt. He didn't need to repeat the address. This was an innate knowledge now. He just lay back and felt himself sink into the moist terrain. Just as he was withdrawing into the earth, Percy the pigeon leapt at him.
Frank, take me too.